The atmosphere inside the America's Got Talent theater was already electric. Families, friends, and fans filled the seats, buzzing with anticipation for the next performer. The judges, Simon Cowell, Heidi Klum, Sofia Vergara, and Howie Mandel, leaned back in their chairs, sipping water and glancing at the stage. Suddenly, the announcer's voice echoed, "Next up, we have Jesus, from Manila." The audience reacted instantly. Some gasped, some chuckled, others looked confused. The name alone was enough to capture everyone's attention. Even Simon raised one eyebrow, his lips forming the faintest smirk. Did he just say Jesus? He muttered under his breath, exchanging a quick glance with Heidi. She smiled, intrigued. A slender young man walked onto the stage. He wore simple clothes, a neatly pressed white shirt and dark jeans, nothing flashy or extravagant. Yet, despite his modest appearance, there was something magnetic about him. He carried himself with humility, but his eyes shone with quiet determination. As he approached the microphone, the entire theater seemed to fall silent, curious to know more about this unusual contestant. "Hello there," Sophia began warmly. "What's your name?" The young man gave a gentle smile. "My name is Jesus, Jesus from Manila, Philippines." The audience chuckled softly at the familiarity of the name, but they weren't mocking, it was a reaction of surprise, even fascination. Heidi tilted her head and said, "Wow, that's a very strong name to carry." Simon, always the sharpest in tone, leaned forward and asked, "So Jesus, what brings you here today?" "YAGT." Jesus took a deep breath. His voice, though soft, carried sincerity that immediately commanded attention. "I come from Manila. Life has never been easy where I'm from. Growing up, I lived in poverty. There were days when I didn't know where my next meal would come from. But in the middle of that struggle, music gave me strength. Singing became my way of praying, my way of surviving. And today, I'm here not just to sing, but to share a message. A message of hope, of faith, and of love. Because I believe music can heal people's hearts." The crowd fell silent again, this time not from curiosity but from respect. There was something deeply moving in the way he spoke, simple, unpolished, but filled with authenticity. Even Simon, usually the toughest critic, seemed momentarily taken aback. Heidi's eyes glistened slightly as she asked, "So what will you be singing for us tonight?" Jesus smiled humbly. "It's a song that means a lot to me. A song about strength in the darkest times. I believe the world needs this message right now more than ever." Simon nodded, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine interest. "All right then, whenever you're ready." The lights dimmed. A hush spread across the audience as the stage transformed into a soft blue glow. A single spotlight fell on Jesus, illuminating his figure against the darkened theater. He closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his hands together as if in silent prayer. Then he took one final breath, ready to release his voice. Before he even sang a note, there was a palpable tension in the room, a sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. And in that moment, the young man from Manila stood poised at the edge of destiny. The judges leaned forward, the cameras zoomed in, and the audience braced themselves. They weren't just about to witness another contestant performing, they were about to hear the story of a man who carried an entire lifetime of struggle and faith in his voice. The air was heavy with anticipation. And then, the music began. The theater lights dimmed further, plunging the audience into an atmosphere of suspense. A hush blanketed the crowd. The giant AGT logo behind the stage faded into a swirl of soft golden light, and the first notes of the music began to play, gentle, almost fragile, as if echoing straight from the heart. Jesus stood still for a moment, eyes closed, one hand lightly gripping the microphone. It was as if he was gathering every memory, every wound, and every dream inside him, preparing to release them through his voice. Then, with a deep breath, he began to sing. The very first note stunned the room. It was powerful, controlled, yet dripping with raw emotion. His tone carried both pain and beauty, as though every syllable was carved from the struggles of his life in Manila. His voice filled the entire theater, soaring upward and echoing off the walls, wrapping itself around every person listening. People in the audience leaned forward instinctively. Within seconds, goosebumps spread across their arms. It wasn't just singing, it was storytelling through sound, and it was impossible to look away. Simon Cowell's expression immediately changed. The smirk was gone. His eyes widened slightly, his lips parted, and his head tilted as if he was trying to process what he was hearing. For a man who had listened to thousands of voices, this one carried something beyond technique, it carried truth. As the verses continued, Jesus' voice rose higher, layering strength upon vulnerability. His delivery was full of contrasts, at one moment tender and whisper-like, almost as though he was singing a lullaby, and in the next moment, thunderous and commanding, shaking the walls with conviction. Heidi placed her hand over her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered softly, though her mic wasn't on. Beside her, Sophia leaned closer to Howie, whispering, "He's giving everything he has." Meanwhile, backstage, Terry Crews stood motionless, his giant hands clasped together. He was transfixed, his usually animated energy stilled by the force of the performance. His eyes glistened as he mouthed, "This is incredible." Midway through the song, the camera panned across the audience. People were wiping away tears. A woman in the front row clutched her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the emotion pouring off the stage. A man further back shook his head in disbelief, as if wondering how someone so unassuming could hold such a monumental gift inside him. Then came the high note. Jesus closed his eyes, raised his head toward the ceiling, and let his voice explode upward, stretching into a note so pure and so powerful that the entire theater erupted in applause, even before he had finished holding it. The sound was rich, unbroken, like a ribbon of gold slicing through the air. It was a note that didn't just showcase talent, it showcased soul. The cheering was immediate. People couldn't contain themselves. Some stood up mid-performance, clapping, screaming, cheering, while Jesus kept going, undistracted, pouring his entire heart out. The orchestra swelled with him, the lights behind him flared brighter, and for a moment it felt as if heaven itself had cracked open just to listen. Simon leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. His face betrayed emotion, a softness rarely seen from him. His usual critique was absent, he simply looked, moved. It was as though he recognized in this young man something that transcended competition, a voice carrying a divine message. As the final chorus built, Jesus gave everything he had left. His chest expanded, his voice soared higher and higher, blending strength with vulnerability in a way that pierced through every heart in the room. And then, suddenly, he dropped his tone into a softer, trembling finish, barely above a whisper. The music faded. Silence fell. For a split second, the entire theater was frozen in awe. No one moved, no one breathed. The last note still hung in the air like a sacred echo. And then, the explosion came. The audience erupted into a roaring ovation, screaming, clapping, and stomping their feet. People jumped to their feet in unison, forming a massive standing ovation that shook the theater. Heidi clapped furiously, tears streaming down her face. Sophia stood and waved her arms toward the audience as if saying, "This man is unbelievable." Backstage, Terry Crews pumped both fists in the air, overcome with joy, shouting, "Yes. That's how you do it." But all eyes returned to Simon Cowell. The man known for his brutal honesty sat completely still, his hands clasped together in front of his lips. His eyes glistened faintly, though he quickly blinked, unwilling to show too much. Still, his expression gave it away. He was deeply, profoundly shaken. On stage, Jesus bowed humbly, almost shyly, as though he hadn't realized the storm of emotion he had unleashed. He didn't smile or boast, instead, he simply pressed his hands together again in gratitude, his lips mouthing silently, "Thank you." The moment felt timeless. In just a few minutes, this young man from Manila had transformed a stage into a sanctuary, turning a performance into an experience, and leaving the audience with the sense that they had witnessed not just talent, but something extraordinary, something spiritual. The final note had barely dissolved into the silence of the theater when the storm erupted. The audience roared to life, a tidal wave of applause and cheers crashing against the stage. People leapt from their seats, stomping their feet, clapping furiously, and shouting his name, "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" The entire building seemed to shake under the weight of the ovation. Jesus from Manila bowed deeply, almost overwhelmed by the force of love rushing toward him. His hands trembled as he pressed them together in gratitude, bowing again and again. Despite the thunderous reaction, his face showed humility. He did not strut or celebrate, instead, he seemed humbled, even slightly emotional, as though the performance had drained every ounce of his soul. On the judges' panel, Heidi Klum was the first to speak. She leaned forward, tears glimmering in her eyes, and said, "I don't even know how to describe what just happened. Your voice, it went straight into my heart. You didn't just sing, you made us feel. That is rare. That is powerful." The audience cheered again, echoing her sentiment. Next, Sofia Vergara shook her head in disbelief. She gestured toward Jesus with wide eyes and said, "You don't even look nervous up there." It was like watching someone who was born for this stage. I could feel your soul in every single note. It was perfect. More cheers, more applause. Howie Mandel leaned back in his chair, tapping the desk lightly, a reflective smile on his face. "I've been on this panel for many seasons, and I've seen talent from all over the world," he said. "But you brought something unique tonight. It wasn't just talent, it was connection. You reached every single person in this room. That's not something you can teach, that's a gift." Jesus bowed once again, visibly touched. His eyes brimmed with tears now, but he kept his composure. Finally, all eyes turned toward Simon Cowell. The room hushed again. Simon's opinion was always the one that carried the most weight, and tonight was no exception. He sat forward, resting his hands on the desk, his gaze fixed firmly on the young man before him. His face, unusually soft, betrayed a mixture of awe and respect. After a long pause, Simon spoke. "Jesus," he began, his voice lower and more deliberate than usual. "I have sat in this chair for a very long time. I've heard thousands of singers, some good, some unforgettable. But tonight," he stopped, his words catching slightly. He exhaled and continued, "Tonight, I witnessed something I will never forget. You didn't just perform a song. You gave us a message. A message of hope, of faith, and of strength. And I think the world desperately needs to hear that right now." The audience exploded with agreement, clapping and shouting in support. Simon, however, raised his hand slightly to calm them. His gaze never left Jesus. "I don't say this lightly," Simon added, "but I believe your voice, and your story, could change lives. You shook this room tonight. And you shook me." And then, without another word, Simon reached out his hand and slammed the golden buzzer. The theater erupted. A blinding shower of golden confetti burst from the ceiling, raining down on the stage in shimmering cascades. The audience screamed louder than ever, some jumping up and down, waving their arms in celebration. The cameras zoomed in on Jesus, who fell to his knees, his hands covering his face as tears poured freely down his cheeks. He couldn't believe it. The dream that once seemed unreachable, standing on the AGT stage, being recognized by the world, had just become reality. Terry Crews, watching from backstage, sprinted onto the stage without hesitation. He wrapped Jesus in a massive bear hug, lifting him slightly off the ground as golden confetti stuck to their clothes and hair. "You did it, man!" Terry shouted over the noise. "You shook the world tonight." The judges stood, clapping and smiling. Heidi dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, Sophia beamed, Howie pumped his fist in the air, and Simon simply sat back, smiling quietly, a rare, genuine smile that carried both pride and admiration. The camera panned across the audience. Children were on their parents' shoulders, couples were embracing, and strangers clapped together as if they had just shared in something historic. For a brief moment, everyone in the theater was united, connected by the voice of a humble young man from Manila who had dared to dream. On stage, Jesus finally rose to his feet again. He spread his arms wide, letting the golden confetti fall around him like a blessing. His tear-streaked face broke into the most radiant smile, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and pure joy. He mouthed the words, "Thank you," again and again, looking up toward the heavens as if to dedicate the moment to something greater than himself. The music swelled, the audience continued to roar, and the words, "Golden Buzzer," flashed across the giant screens. It was not just a victory. It was a moment that transcended entertainment. A moment of faith, hope, and human connection. And as Simon had said, it was a moment that shook the world.